Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and very good morning. Yang berbahagia Profesor Emeritus Datuk Dr. Radwan Cik Ros, Presiden Majlis Profesor Negara. Yang berbahagia Profesor TS Dr. Muhammad Yusof Muhammad Taib, Ketua Pegawai Operasi Majlis Profesor Negara. Yang berbahagia Profesor Datuk Dr. Inayah Yaakob, Presiden and Vice Chancellor IUKL, yang diwakili oleh yang berbahagia Dr. Nurhaiza Nordin, Timbalan Naib Chancellor Akademik. All the speakers, yang berbahagia Prof. Madya, Dr. Muhammad Wira, Muhammad Shafiei from USM, and yang berbahagia Prof. Madya, Dr. Chen from Sunway University, and also our industry, from the industry yang berbahagia Muhammad Irwan Ahmad from Sarawak Energy Berhad. So, welcome to our event today, Minda Profesor, with the title Net Zero Emission and Sustainable Development Goals. So before we proceed, I would like to call Dr. Radwan for welcoming remarks. Please.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good morning to all of you. Panelists, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Majlis Profesor Negara. This is a series of discussion on current issues. We heard about climate change, we heard about all sort of phenomena related to climate. Then now we have three experts to discuss on the issue that is very, very close to us. And as a country, we are also with another 190 countries in the world that agreed on Paris Agreement 2015 to reduce the climate rise to 1.5 Celsius. And we also have a target by 2025 to have the net zero emissions on carbon. That's our target. Hopefully, by policy initiative, projects, and also any other programs that introduced by the government, industry, and etc., we could achieve that target. So we leave it to the three panels to discuss on this very important topic to the public to hear from you. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Prof. Emeritus Dr. Radwan, for the welcoming remark. So before we proceed, I would like to explain a little bit about this event. Okay, this program is actually a program in a collaboration with Majlis Profesor Negara, IUKL, and Cluster Sumber Asli and Alam Sekitar Majlis Profesor Negara. I also would like to introduce myself. Maybe I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Haslenda, the moderator for this session today, and I'm from University Technology Malaysia, and also the setiausaha under this cluster Sumber Asli dan Alam Sekitar. Okay, alright. So I think before we proceed, maybe we can let the panelists to introduce a little bit about yourself. Maybe we start with Dr. Wira. Yes, please, Dr. Wira.
Thank you very much, the Chair, Professor Haslenda, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, my fellow forum members. My name is Muhammad Wira, Muhammad Shafiei. I am the Director of CGSS, Center for Global Sustainability Studies in USM, which was set up in 2008 and now still doing whatever had been planned since 2008, which is achieving sustainability. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Dr. Wira. So now I would like to invite Dr. Chen to introduce a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Haslenda. I am Dr. Chen. I am the head of the Jeffrey Sachs Center on Sustainable Development in Sunway University. So my primary training is in plant sciences. So that's how I, target carbon credits or carbon cycles. But as a center, our primary institutional aim is to come up with certain advisory or policies for at national level or ASEAN level for how to achieve the green objectives. And also within Sunway Group, we provide the scientific advice to how the company or the group can achieve the same goals as the nation.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. And we also have industry representative today. So the panelist is from Sarawak Energy, Encik Irwan. So please introduce a little bit about yourself, Encik Irwan.
Okay, thank you, Prof. So my name is Mohd Irwan bin Aman. I'm from Sarawak Energy. It's an honor to be speaking in front of all the academicians that Professor is on. So for Sarawak Energy, we are similar to Tenaga Nasional, right? But different in terms of our portfolio, in terms of projects and our generations. That's the main thing. I'm heading the sustainability department. So departments that we call responsible to set the strategy for the company in moving forward, especially toward net zero and 1.5 degrees C targets. Thank you.
So, and Encik Irwan also is very active in one of the NGO, right?
So basically, again, on sustainability, it's all about having a platform to champion or to lead. Doesn't matter which organization you are from, but each one of us will need a role model to champion specific topics. So we can use that not only to use it to push it from internal. All right, so from the banks, from universities, or from other Petronas, for example, areas that they are championing. So we use that for our internal requirements or push. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. To all panelists, so I think maybe we can start with because I think the title for today's talk or maybe a discussion is about net zero and also sustainable development goals. Actually, this is two very important things. So before we proceed, I would like to ask Dr. Wira about the definition, what does it mean by net zero, and how the net zero is related to sustainable development goals. Yes, please, Dr. Wira.
Right, thank you very much for the question. Net zero is actually now an acceptable phrase. We no longer confuse net zero with zero pay. We no longer thought net zero is about wanting to actually achieve negative equity. It is something positive now. You thought possibly before net zero is something negative, but now it is something important for us to achieve whatever sustainable development goals that had actually been outlined in net zero. Net zero means achieving a balance between the greenhouse gas emissions that we produce and the ones we can take out from the atmosphere. So whatever we produce should be taken away from the atmosphere. That is the basis for net zero. Just want to put things into perspective. If we look at the greenhouse gas emissions that had actually been produced globally last year, it's about 50 billion tons CO2e. That was last year. That was 50 billion tons CO2e that had been produced globally. But the ones that can be absorbed by the natural systems on Earth, which is our natural carbon sinks, namely the ocean and the forest, is only less than 20%. It's about 19%. It means there is a problem for us because 81% of those greenhouse gas that we had emitted cannot be absorbed by the natural system that we've got on Earth. So where those greenhouse gas is going to be stored. So it's supposed to actually move out of our atmosphere, but it got stuck in the atmosphere because of the characteristics of the greenhouse gas emissions that make it encapsulating the atmosphere to the point that we face global warming. So because of that, net zero is a priority now. We do not want to see the largest man-made natural disaster, which is going to be larger than World War I, World War II combined, much, much larger than that. We cannot stop our greenhouse gas emissions and we cannot actually put that away from the atmosphere. So the whole thing about net zero is wanting to strike that balance. We want to go as zero as possible. Whatever we emit, let's say in this country, in Malaysia, the carbon footprint for each person is it's hovering between 7 to 8 CO2e per person. 7 to 8 tons per person. So we want to actually, by individual, make sure if we emit, let's say 7 tons of CO2e, we want to make sure we put away 7 tons of CO2e away to negate the carbon that we had emitted. So it is about striking that balance to make it as zero as possible. The ones that's got stuck in the atmosphere is already there. There must be ways technologically to put it away. We had actually faced this problem with ozone layer depletion that we had faced in the 1980s. That had almost been solved as a result of mankind working together to reduce refrigeration use to the point that we actually deplete the ozone layer. It's already been solved now. But now we are facing this new problem with greenhouse gas emission, and that's why we are looking at net zero that we want to achieve by 2050. I hope
All right.
that would answer your question, Prof.
Insight to provide an insight about net zero, and probably can you explain a little bit how the net zero is related to SDG, Sustainable Development Goal?
You can always actually put net zero with all facets of Sustainable Development Goals from 1 to 17. But in net zero, we are basically interested in SDG 7, Goal 7, which is affordable and clean energy. That is actually the biggest culprit for the greenhouse gas emissions because it's been estimated that 75% of greenhouse gas emissions come from energy generation and energy usage. So we are looking at actually ways where we could mitigate the greenhouse gas emissions technologically and how we can adapt to the impact of climate change as a result of these greenhouse gas emissions that leads to global warming, that leads to actually problems in the natural environment system. So the one SDG that is very much related in both ways to net zero would be SDG 7, goal number 7. But of course, you could actually relate net zero with every single facet, as I've said just now, from SDG 1 to 17. You could actually see how net zero could actually lead to poverty if it is not being implemented in a wise way. Because you need to remember those people who are actually living on their bread lines, for example, they could actually see their energy bills increasing simply because we want to actually cater the problem of net zero. There are actually economically problems with that, socially problems with that, as well as environmentally. So we need to be taking a wise approach. Yes, we want to protect the environment, but we want to actually protect the environment and social, the economy and social system, pardon me, because the human beings is very much part of the ecosystem where we live in now.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Wira. And now I would like to invite Dr. Chen to provide some input related to net zero and also SDG, because this is the title of our session today. And do you think that, from your opinion, do you think that Malaysia is on track? Because actually Malaysia pledged to achieve net zero in 2050. So even though we are actually facing a challenge during COVID-19, so are we now is on track? Are we able to achieve net zero in 2050? So maybe Dr. Chen can discuss about this.
Yeah. So I guess the good news is that we are not that far away compared to the rest of the world in terms of our progress. But overall, let's just say that we are as a global community, we are still lagging behind. The dream or the idea to hit net zero by 2050 is an ambitious one. It is ambitious. And I guess the best way to describe it, as Professor Wira mentioned, energy is a huge problem. One of the things that links the SDGs to net zero is that SDGs are meant to be talking about the overall development of human capital. How can you lift up the various groups of marginalized communities and have a fairer world for everyone? And a key component of that is making sure that there's enough energy for everyone, because that's really a limiting factor for many places in the world. It is a limiting factor for most of our economy. If you think about what drives our economy, right? Transportation, manufacturing, even the internet, or your data centers, for example. There's a reason Singapore has banned data centers, and the data centers are coming over to Malaysia. And it's the idea of, can you have sufficient economic growth for the amount of energy you put, right? So how does that link to net zero? Unfortunately for us, at the moment, the vast majority of our energy supplies come from fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. Yes, we have made great improvements in renewable energy. There are some countries in the world, especially those in the more developed Western nations, that have transitioned a lot of their, I use the term, utility electricity to renewable energy. And that's good. And that's somewhere Malaysia would need to try to keep up to or to achieve. But as I remind my students or my audience when I give talks, one of the key ways in which these nations have achieved their net zero is by shifting their manufacturing externally. So all the manufacturing, the factories are now in China. A lot of them are now moving to Southeast Asia because that's for political reasons. Let's put it that way. And therefore, one of the key tenets of SDGs when we say we want a fairer world is the idea that there needs to be also this concept of energy justice. Mm-hmm. That you cannot have a situation where nations claim that they have achieved net zero. Yes, partly by making sure that their utility grid is green, solar power, wind power. You can talk about nuclear, that's a whole other discussion. But there's also a need to see whether, in terms of manufacturing, production, farming, that's another source of significant source of greenhouse gases. How can we make our global economic system fairer for everyone, given the fact that A, in order to have economic development, you need energy. B, at the moment, our primary energy source is fossil fuel. So that balance between SDGs and net zero, that's the connection there. I would say, again, is energy. That's why I would agree with energy. Because we can't forget fertilizers. Just to continue. For fertilizers, food, half of our food production globally is dependent on artificial fertilizers, and we make artificial fertilizers using natural gas, and that's a fossil fuel. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. So do you think that is it because of the COVID-19 is one of the factors that make our target to achieve net zero as one of the hurdles to achieve in 2050? Yeah.
So COVID-19 definitely affected the SDGs. So the SDGs as a measure of how we can reach a more developed global society, COVID-19 really set us back years, if not decades. So that's the SDG. Now, about net zero. COVID-19 actually, as a scientist, was a very interesting experiment. With regards to, it's a positive experiment with regards to net zero, because it forces at a global scale to test the concept of saying, what happens if you shut down the entire global economy to its bare minimum? Right? So what I'm referring to, I just want to point out, I'm not saying that industries like recreation or hospitality or airlines, I'm not saying they are not vital or they are not important. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm trying to get at is, if you reduce economic activity to the bare minimum, which is effectively what we did with COVID-19, nobody could leave their homes. Nobody could go on holiday. Nobody could get out of a certain radius, in a way, restricting our energy use, if you think about it, right? What we achieved in terms of carbon reduction was at best 7%, and at the deepest trough was 13%, right? So 7% across the year 2020, I think. The deepest point was March 2020, 13%. Now, why is this relevant? The target for net zero is that we will need to reduce our carbon emissions by 3.6% net carbon emissions every year until 2050. That is the target to hit net zero by 2050. During the 2020, the year of COVID, we had as a year or over the year, 7% reduction. So all of the things that we did at the global community scale to reduce movement, which in a way reflects as the reduction of energy for transportation, gave us double what we would need annually to reduce every year. The bad part about this scenario is that I think all of you will feel we really suffered as a society, not just in terms of money, but also as socially, right? There's a lot of suffering and there was a lot of pain. Can we do half of that every year for the next 30 years? That's the question, so to speak. So to come back to your question, how has COVID-19 affected the net zero aim? I say it has given us a glimpse into an extreme way in which the objectives could be achieved, but it is not the ideal way. So ideally, we would achieve net zero by making our energy systems more efficient, or we find a greener way to get energy. But in an extreme case, experimentally, we have run the experiment. If we live in a fossil fuel world and we want to at the same time have net zero, we will need to have some severe reductions in our way of life, which is, it's not something that I don't think anyone would recommend, but that's what the science says. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Chen, for your input. So now let's move to our another panel from industry, and Cik Irwan. So I think Cik Irwan's from Sarawak. Sarawak, we cannot deny, is one of the state that is very, very aggressive and very committed to achieve a net zero. There are, I think everyone is look up to Sarawak, and maybe today Cik Irwan can share with us what is the journey of Sarawak Energy to achieve net zero. Yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you again, Prof. So you mentioned about we are being aggressive. Yes, it's giving pressure to us as well. Because the Premier saying we're doing that way, there's a clear target for us as a company, state-owned companies, we have to try our best to achieve it. In terms of our journey, it started off way back 70s, 80s, where the state would like to develop a hydropower space, try to harness the renewable energy of hydropower. Started way back then. Even when I joined Sarawak Energy, I was from Tenaga and Mitsubishi before. When I joined Sarawak Energy, the focus is not so much on the MDS or Millennium Development Goal or SDG. It's focusing on how to develop hydropower in a sustainable manner that meet international requirements. Because there are a lot of legacy issues. I talked to from IUM just now to balance the social part. So that's the challenge for us. So basically, we have put targets to ourselves. Whatever we do in our hydropower development or operation, it must meet international best practices in terms of sustainability. Start off, and then 2 to 3 years after that, we feel that there's a vacuum. We are focusing on projects, but as a company, what's the direction? What's the strategy in sustainability? So that's why in 2014, we produced our sustainability reports. Basically, if you talk about SDG toward net zero whatsoever, it must be based on data, accurate data that represent our operation. And that data should be credential enough. So in 2014, we are the first one to publish for power utilities within this region to publish our sustainability report, and all the data, the key data, being validated, because that's where we start. And then all this coming in, talking about climate change and so on. That's why even 2014, we monitor our grid emission. So how it's dropped. When Bakun come into the picture, when Murum come into the picture, how it's dropped. So we see climate change will be one of the main issue in the future. Okay, if you talk about sustainability, to me, as an industrial player, it's always about, it's a strategic management. Just that we add in ESG into it, right? It's not only strategic, but also ESG put it in together for our own analysis. So where we are going, when we do all this analysis, strategy and so on, we feel that climate change will be an issue. Okay, from Kyoto, then Kyoto, now Paris Agreement. So Paris Agreement, as Chairman of Majlis Profesor Negara mentioned earlier, 192 companies sign off. Okay, every countries around the globe sign off. So that's a commitment. So how that commitment cascade down to companies? For sure, it will cascade down. Start with what you see now, financial institution. Cascade with financial institution, because we, Sarawak Energy, we're developing huge projects. We're talking about hydropower projects. One project alone is about 10 billion, roughly about the figures. So we can see the requirement of our investors, they're putting that in as well. So again, in terms of our journey, start off with projects, focus, and then we see how it's become a competitive advantage or it become business requirement for us. Then starting from that, it's just whatever happened is just history. There are a lot of requirement coming in terms of reporting, according to TCFD standards, GRI and so on. So we are incorporate that into our operations and our commitment. That's why our company, we commit to 1.5 degrees C, way back 2020. It's a strong commitment from our companies to say that we are going toward that direction. We need to achieve it by 2030 near terms. So of course, net zero, we need to revise. We need to have a midterm first before we go to the long term. Because long term is quite difficult to analyze or to conduct a scenario. We can, but accuracy is not that accurate. That's why that's in short our journey moving forward. So again now, since the state already announced Sarawak state will be going for net zero by 2050, that's another driver and another as a pressure to us as well. How we going to decarbonize our grid. Again, from 2010 to now, our grid in terms of intensity has dropped 72%. 72%. So we are well below 2 degrees C target if we are following the using the Paris Agreement targets. 2 degrees C, we are below, but we basically above, it's in between 2 and 1.5 degrees C targets. So again, to really reduce it quite easy, the first improvement. Okay? But the last hurdle will be a very difficult one. What else we can do? Right? So we still have coal-fired, we still have gas. So how we further reduce that? Not only for the supply side, but also on our operation side as well. In science-based target, we call it Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. The most difficult one will be Scope 3. I think I should stop there first. Prof. Very long.
It's very, very interesting. I'm very, very impressed with the Sarawak Energy because I think until now you are able to achieve up to 72% emissions reductions. Probably, if you don't mind, probably you can share what is the strategies that Sarawak Energy have implemented in short term or maybe in mid term in order to achieve this significant reduction.
Yeah, the main contribution will be hydropower, right? Hydropower. So a huge drop, and we're still focusing on hydropower as a source. But we also think about what else we can do. Other renewable. If we're talking about, we have a floating solar now, 50 megawatts under construction. Talking about hydrogen, still a pilot projects. We have to change our fleet into EVs that's still in a pilot projects. So what else? Improvement in terms of our own operation, not only on the mitigation side to reduce the emissions, but we need to also think about adaptation in terms of climate change. Because again, it will be just not strategic enough, we just focus on the mitigation part. But we don't think the impact of climate change to our operation. Hydro, the main fuel is water. What happened, climate change really changed the weather pattern, right? There will be long drought and so on. So how are we going to manage that in future? Changing weather pattern, we increase ambient temperature. How that impacts our transmission, efficiency of our transmissions, efficiency of our power generation for our thermal plant. So all this, we look at, we should look at it as a holistic package, holistics and integrated. We can't just say look, operation and then supply, climate change. No, it should be holistic enough. It's a strategic together with AHG. So in terms of division now is hydro, but in the future it might change to other thing, maybe hydrogen. That's why for all our gas-fired power plant is a hydrogen ready. So one hydrogen become more practical or economic of scale is there, it's become practical or visible to do it, then our coal gas-fired power plant is ready to utilize it. So that's how we look at it.
All right. Thank you, Encik Irwan, for sharing your short-term and also mid-terms to achieve the emission reduction targets. Okay, now let's move to Dr. Chen again. Yeah, I think from the industry perspective, it seems like technology-based solution is very, very crucial in order to achieve emissions reductions. So probably you can provide your insight on top of technology-based solutions. Is there any other solutions that is required in order to for Malaysia to achieve emissions reduction targets? Yes, please.
So I guess usually you would say that the opposite of technology-based solutions would be nature-based solutions, and this is something that Malaysia can pride itself in the sense that we do have an environment that facilitates large amounts of carbon pull down, and what I mean by that is that because we live in a tropical environment that has a lot of rainfall, is warm, we do have a lot of plant growth. So the growth of the plant itself is the carbon storage. But I always like to make sure that people are aware that it's going to be difficult to rely on nature-based solutions to achieve the end goal. And I always use this analogy. If you remove all humans from the planet somehow, and all of our buildings and all of our infrastructure, so you just had the Earth again, and you allow the planet to regrow completely back to the way it was before we started changing the face of the planet, right? You would still have 2/3 elevated CO2 in the atmosphere. And the reason you will have that is simply because we have to account for the fact that what drives our civilization? We are digging fossil fuels out of the ground, coal, gas, petroleum, and we are combusting it. And the natural process to put that back into the ground is very, very long. We're talking about millions of years, right? So the nature-based solutions can solve the problem of land use change, and if we are lucky, it can also solve a bit of the problem of fossil fuel combustion. But it will not be the final solution simply because we don't have enough land. So that's the limitation to that. Not to say that we should not plant trees. That's not what I'm saying here. But it needs to be sort of, on the one hand, we do it, but on the other hand, we need to be aware that we still have a problem. And the problem is every barrel of oil we pump out, if you think about the carbon, that has to go back down into the ground. That's really a problem. So 2 ways to deal with it. One is to not bring it out of the ground, and the other is to pump it back down. So in both cases, you could say that they are technology-based solutions. Having said that, the way I would encourage the use of nature-based solutions is not so much of the planting of trees, but the not cutting down of trees, if that makes sense. So it is the conservation of natural systems that would really drive quote-unquote nature-based solutions, as opposed to trying to engineer a nature-based solution. So where I'm getting at is that let's leave aside this question of biodiversity for the time being. Let's leave aside the question of whether or not the health of the ecosystems has an impact on our health. Let's just focus purely on CO2 emissions. It behooves us to make sure that the natural environment that we have at the moment is not further degraded, rather than try to balance degradation with replanting. generally speaking. I know this is a very generic statement, and real life is a lot more complicated, speaking for Sunway Group. But the idea here is that the calculation for nature-based solutions should focus on the conservation of resources. The replanting is big, but that's sort of secondary to the primary function of just not doing more damage. Yeah. So that's how I would describe nature-based solutions.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you for the input. And can you give a comment in terms of governance in Malaysia? Do you think that the current governance is really can support our national aspiration to achieve net zero in 2050?
One good thing coming from the plant side is we have managed to, more or less, I know there are some critics still, achieve what we promised in terms of slowing down deforestation for palm oil. That is always a big discussion point in Malaysia and Indonesia and in our relations with the EU. And so I personally think we've achieved quite a lot on that front. Now, some critics may say the reason we have slowed down on deforestation is because all the good land have been used. That's one way to see it. But the way that I would like to see is, in the absence of willpower from the government, in the absence of regulations, I'm sure the situation will be much worse. So to the extent that we have managed to constrain the growth of more land for planting, at the same time being able to increase our production by becoming more efficient with the land that we have, by replanting palm oil trees that are more productive, thanks to all of the work that's been done on that side. That's something that I think the government can be given credit for, that we have achieved what we sought to achieve, increased productivity for the palm oil industry, but not at the cost of more and more. In terms of the leadership of trying to put this as a main focus, and when I say this, I mean that one I think the government can be commended, because it's a bit of a low bar. But America, for example, famously has difficulty keeping its promises. In a very specific case, I'm referring to the Paris Climate Agreement. So in that sense, the fact that we have a government that's taken that seriously, has skated through Bursa Malaysia and through Bank Negara, the CCP, the Climate Change Principle Taxonomy, the TCFD, now all big companies that are on Bursa have to start reporting based not just on your financials, but also the ESG side. That can only happen when there is buy-in from the very top. So on that one, we are moving in the right direction. Yeah.
All right. So we are glad to feel that actually we are in the right direction, hopefully our target can be achieved, even though it's a very ambitious. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Chen. And now, according to Dr. Wira, you mentioned that 70% of the total emission come from the energy sector. And 70%. 75%, sorry. 75% of the total emissions come from the energy sector. And recently, there is a roadmap called Energy Transition Roadmap. Yeah. So do you think that this roadmap is very, very helpful or can support the target? Because actually under this roadmap, they actually set out 6 energy transition levels, including renewable energy, hydrogen, bioenergy, green mobility, energy efficiency, and carbon capture, utilization and storage. So can you discuss about this and how actually the energy transition roadmap can support the target to achieve net zero?
Okay, thank you for the question, Prof. I think the government had actually shown that we are indeed serious in cutting down our carbon emissions by announcing that energy transition roadmap. It is, in my own opinion, personally, it is akin to us digging our own grave if we are not being careful there. Because we do know we actually generate a lot of income from the hydrocarbon exploration from our own Fortune 500 company, Petronas. By having such a roadmap, we could actually see we want to actually the dependency on hydrocarbon exploration. But we are strong enough to actually maintain that outlook by saying, hang on, okay, yes, we do know we are going to use less hydrocarbon, but we had identified a number of impactful and fruitful, perhaps in the future, new economic sectors that could actually allow us to divest to another area of growth, not just in hydrocarbon. So we are being honest there. Yes, we are going to be impacted in the long run. Then again, we had actually seen a lot of potentials so that we could plug some of the gaps to the point that it is not going to compromise the nation economically. In my opinion, it is a strong message. It could actually work, provided that we fill up some of the gaps that had actually been identified in that roadmap and be strong so that it is not going to be changed in the near future. A deeper electrification is a strong message, even though we do know we've only got like 3,000 power charging station for our own electric vehicles. So we need to actually make a huge leap to actually install more charging stations for our EV. That is one of the roadmaps. Hydrogen-wise, yes, we do actually have blue hydrogen. It's been produced now. But green hydrogen is a tricky one to actually promise, because as of now, the world had not even produced 1% of green hydrogen to all the hydrogen supplies that exist now. So that is another big question, whether we could actually achieve that roadmap. I think if we proceed to that roadmap, we could actually show by 2050, when we are in the midst of net zero ambition, we could see in the long run we managed to use less fossil fuels and rely on renewable energy. As of now, we've only produced like 20% of our energy coming from renewable energy sources. So 80% comes from coal and from hydrocarbon. That is the situation now. So hopefully that could be reduced by 40% in 2050. But I think Dr. Chen put it mildly by saying, yes, we are ambitious, we are actually on track. But if we want to be critical, self-critical, if we look at what Malaysia promised in our net zero target 2050, we are still not producing to what we want to achieve, which is 1.5C by 2100. We want to actually see the efforts to limit 1.5C over pre-industrial level, but we are not there yet, globally and nationally. Again, I am referring to the Paris Climate Agreement 2015. Whatever had been promised by the 192 governments, nations in that Paris Climate Agreement is simply not sufficient, I'm afraid, because if we are to stick to whatever had been agreed by those nations in cutting carbon emissions, we are still going to end up with an increase of 2.8C by 2100, even though our ambition is 1.5C. And we do know, and we do understand now from data gathered from climate scientists, to be at 2.8C is simply disastrous. Achieving 1.5C can be done. 2C was initially targeted in 2015, but then again, it was not seen as sufficient. We need to actually be at 1.5C in our target for the increase in our temperature globally. And again, we do actually have another milestone before 2100, before 2050, which is 2030. In 2030, looking at 2050, of course, as an outlook, which is going to be 7 years from now, globally, we target to reduce our carbon emission, to cut the carbon emission by 45% by using 2010 figures. 45%. But whatever had been promised by those nations, we included Malaysia, in Paris Climate Agreement, does actually show it is not a 45% reduction in carbon emission, but rather an addition of 10% of carbon emission. So can you imagine, it is like a 55% gap there, rather than a 45% cut in the greenhouse gas emission. So we are nowhere there. In 2030, I think we got 0.001% chance of achieving this in 2030. But mankind had actually demonstrated and shown that when we are being put into difficult situations, when we are being pushed into a corner, we can still actually gather and get together to try to solve problems. And this had actually been demonstrated by that ozone layer lesson that we had actually done. We done this, 1985, it's been discovered, we had depleted our ozone layer, but now it's almost been solved. So there is actually some hopes. By 2050, this could be done, even though it looks like it's going to be difficult. But as long as we support whatever being proposed by United Nations and being implemented by the nation, then we could be there, hopefully, by 2100. Okay, that's my personal opinion.
All right. So it seems like the energy transition roadmap is very, very helpful.
Indeed, yes.
Okay. All right. So and I also would like to comment in terms of the energy transition roadmap, because in the roadmap, it has planned to develop 3 CCUS hubs with a total storage capacity up to 15 million ton per annum by 2030, and to develop another 3 hubs with total storage capacity between 40 to 80 metric ton per annum by 2050. Actually, this is also to comment in terms of the newspaper cutting about this is I think is yesterday newspaper about TNB Petronas Jalan Kerjasama terkait teknologi CCS. So I would like to invite Encik Irwan from industrial perspective. How do you think that CCS can help for CO2 reductions?
Yeah, I think in terms of definitely CCS will have its own role. Even for Sarawak Energy, again, we already decarbonized 72%. Moving forward, we should be below 1.5 degrees C targets. But the residual emissions, because currently we have 5 to 6 million ton CO2 emitted from our operation, which is coming from thermal. Yes, we can reduce through technology. Yes, we can reduce from our operation, change of behavior, but definitely toward net zero, CCS, we have a role to play, right? CCS, nature-based also. So that's why we have a long-term roadmaps. It's already approved by our board last year. So under this roadmap, we have what we're going to do, what kind of technology, what kind of project or initiative that we need to initiate so that we are prepared for all this. Again, we are not public listed companies, we are state-owned, but we are not obliged to do science-based targets. We are not obliged to report using GRI or TCFD, but we are doing that because we know that we need to improve our operations. Okay, that's why definitely CCS will have its role in Sarawak Energy in our operation. The first one will be, again, the technology part of it from now to 2030, and from 2030 to 2050s, CCS and nature-based. We need to start now because investment in nature-based, we can't just go back to our CFO and say, we need 100 million for this project. No, it should be gradually. And because we have quite a big for our catchment area. All right, we go for example, the projects, the potential of afforestation, reforestation for nature base. Of course, Dr. Chen mentioned about conservation. That's another part of it. So if you can focus on the AR part, so that we also increase the capacity of our hydrological capacity of our catchment. So we invest into that area. In terms CCS, yes, in short, Prof, definitely we have a role in that, because most of the potential CCUS will be based in Sawari. So again, it's just for us to just balance it up, which options that fit our needs lah. Right? Be it CCS, or be it the nature base and so on, which one really meet our needs at that particular years or targets that we want.
How about the hydrogens? Because I think now Sarawak is leading in terms of hydrogens. So probably Encik Irwan want to give some comments about hydrogen and how it relates to our target on net zero emissions.
Yeah, definitely. Hydrogen is one of the technology provided. It's coming from green hydrogen. All right, there's a requirement. For now, for our grid, our emission is 0.19 ton CO2 per megawatt hour. It's not green yet. Green means if you tap straight to our hydropower projects, because there's a life cycle emissions that attach to that. There's what I know, because hydrogen championed by SEDC Energy. They're the one been tasked to champion large scale hydrogen. We have our own hydrogen plant, but it's mainly on R&D. So SEDC Energy will have it on a big plant. So they're working with what I know is Korean and Japanese companies, just to really look into it and try to build it, scale up. So definitely hydrogen will be the next, if you ask me, the next technology for everyone. Just that whether the green hydrogen will fetch, because the cost is quite high now, production, whether green hydrogen fetch a good premium for other markets or developed markets. So that's definitely one of the options we are looking at in our long-term roadmap.
Yeah, I think everyone's agreed that actually hydrogen is our future energy. And green hydrogen is actually the best, but now currently we still rely on the grey hydrogen, but we slowly move towards green hydrogen, and hopefully in 2030 beyond.
As Prof mentioned, for now in Malaysia we don't have green hydrogen yet. So
still we rely on the grey hydrogen, but at least we are start one step ahead. So I think it's a good move, and hopefully by 2030 we started to use green hydrogen in our operations. Okay, I think based on the discussion, we see that actually for the industry, they are very clear about their target, their plan. So they have short term, mid terms, and long terms. So we have two academicians here. So maybe I want to hear from the academician, and in fact, I think most of the ladies and gentlemen here is also from academician. So we want to hear from both of you. What is your opinion, the role of academicians to meet this target? Yeah.
So one role of an academician sometimes is also to explain how some situations can be both good and bad at the same time. And I always like to start if I go to banks or corporate training. The first thing I usually explain is Malaysia's promise in the Paris Climate Agreement, the 45% target. So the interesting thing about the 45% target that we promise as a nation for 2030 in Paris is the wording of how we've put the reduction. The reduction states that we are promising 45% reduction of carbon intensity relative to GDP. Now, what does that mean? As a lawyer, that target is very achievable. Because what it means is that you are dividing your carbon emissions by GDP. In other words, there are two ways for you to hit your target. Assume that your GDP does not change, right? And in the case of what we promised in Paris, you set a baseline 2005. So our GDP at 2005 and our emissions at 2005, we promised by 2030 we will have a 45% reduction in carbon intensity. So if your GDP has not grown between 2005 and 2030, then you must reduce your emissions by 45%. However, if you double your GDP in the same time and you didn't change your emissions at all, you would achieve effectively 50% carbon emissions reduction in terms of intensity. In other words, we can beat the Paris Climate Agreement by having higher GDP. So the trick here is that on the one hand, it is actually quite achievable. But on the other hand, scientifically, that's not what we want. What we want at the scientific level is to have an overall reduction in CO2. So on that sense, yes, I agree with Prof. Wira. We are not reaching the targets. In fact, we went up. We actually have an increase in emissions. At the same time, however, we can achieve, technically, our Paris Climate Agreement promises because we have increased our GDP by a higher percentage. So that's sort of where I feel academicians come into play. To explain to the general audience or the public how two things can be true at once. That yes, we are achieving our Paris Climate Agreement promises. We are ahead in many ways. The last time I checked, we were 38%. If you divide what we have done since 2005 as the baseline. So our target is 45, right? We have hit 38%, roughly. Obviously, in that sense, COVID-19 has reduced our objectives because we had a fall in GDP. But otherwise, we are on the way there. However, on the scientific level, we are not achieving the true aim of this, because the aim of this exercise is not to improve, in theory, our carbon intensity effectiveness. That's not what we are trying. What we are trying to do is to reduce absolute CO2 emissions. Why? Because that's what's causing the trouble. So on that side, yes, we have not made that much progress. Having said that, it's better than the alternative, because to look on the bright side of things, the glass half full, as it were. If we did not have these, if we were on the projection that we had in terms of economic development being equal to carbon emissions, we will be in a far worse state today. It wouldn't be plus 10%, it would be plus 25% at least. So again, coming to your question, what is the role of academician in society? Right? It's try to explain to people in as simpler language as possible how we can be how nuanced the situation can be. That yes, we are achieving something, we are not necessarily achieving everything, but it's progress. And yes, progress, it can always be better. It can always be better. But the idea is we have done enough we have done sufficient work to at least be better than where we could have. So that's the bright side of things. Obviously, the negative side of things is we are not hitting the scientific target. So we are still not hitting 1.5. Nowhere close. Yeah, nowhere close.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Chen. And how about Dr. Wira?
I agree with Dr. Chen wholeheartedly. I think we have to actually admire those negotiators acting on our behalf, our nation. When we went to a conference of parties, when we were at Paris Climate Agreement 2015, and when we put those figures of promising 45% cut in our carbon emission, it was actually, apart from what Dr. Chen said just now, it was actually put based on 2005 figures rather than 2010 figures. There is another point that actually shows we have good negotiation skill as a nation. I think if you are to send academics there who actually sees 1 + 1 = 2, then we would actually be following other nations who promise those difficult targets that cannot really be achieved. It is very much achievable. But if we are to go back to what we are doing now as academics, we go back to the teaching and research. The teaching needs to actually be closely aligned to SDG, to the problem of climate action, to which I think those who are actually perhaps above 30 years old are not actually, they're not lucky enough to be exposed to the problem of climate change when they're at secondary schools, when they're at schools. But now I think the education system allows our children to actually understand climate change. Understanding climate technologies is already being taught in the secondary schools. So now at university, we have to actually be aware that those school children who goes to university, they had been exposed to climate change, to sustainability subjects, to climate technologies, green technologies. So we have to follow those themes and offer to them the best curriculum to let them fly rather than be stagnant like us in terms of climate change. That's one thing. And research, it has to actually be based on the need to mitigate climate change as well as to adapt to climate change impact. Those are the two areas I think, honestly speaking, we are not quite good at. We are still relying on technologies coming from the more developed nations. We keep talking about technology transfer, but the technology that had been transferred to us are those kind of inferior technology that are not good enough for us to actually fulfill the 1.5C requirement. And I remember what Dr. Chen said just now about the richer countries shifting their manufacturing facilities to the developing nations, which is very much true. The responsibility has now seems gone to developing nations. I think if we look at the largest emitters by nations, only 7 nations producing 50% of greenhouse gas emissions. And these countries are top of the pile, China, which is officially a developing nation, but they had been made in the last 30, 40 years as the factories of the world. So you've got all these manufacturing facilities being transferred to these developing nations to the point that China become the largest emitters of greenhouse gas, followed by the United States, India, of all nations, European Union, and then Indonesia, 5th in the list. Can you imagine that? And imagine once they got this Nusantara plan in full gear in 20, 30 years' time, I believe they could actually usurp some of those EU nations, not 5th in the list, but they could actually climb to 4th, even 3rd. And then you could actually have other nations like Brazil and Russia to complete that 7 nations who emit 50% of greenhouse gas emissions. So this actually needs to be shared with our students to say, okay, we had done our part, but those other nations had not done our part, had not done their part in wanting to cut global emission level. So there are actually arguments coming from the developing countries in the COP, on the Conference of Parties organized by United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, who wants to actually move ahead with cutting the greenhouse gas emissions, but they seem to actually be impeded by not having the right technology to do it. It's still being held by the developed nations, who in some ways had actually transferred the carbon-intensive projects or carbon-intensive manufacturing facilities to the nation. Now, the data centers is coming towards us. Singapore had actually pushed that away across the border to Malaysia. It's coming to us. If we do not increase the constituent part of our renewable energy, then we would be in great trouble when we report to the UNFCCC in 5 years' time. So it needs to be updated every 5 years. Those figures need to be updated, and we could actually see the carbon emission per capita could be increasing more than 8 to 9 tons per person. That might be possible. Another thing, in universities, we are there to actually show to our students who are going to be the future technologies and leaders on how to actually control our consumption so that we will not emit a lot of carbon That's one point. And another point I could share, in our connections with the industries and communities, we need to actually show it is very much possible to achieve net zero by 2050, but we need two things: technology, and we need every single mankind to actually understand that we are in deep trouble. There is very much human factor that we need to actually address. We are actually in deep trouble. If we don't change our ways, we are not actually consuming resources responsibly, then we could actually be heading towards disaster, not just in 2100, but it could be in 2050, because all the facts are there to actually show it is almost impossible to achieve net zero in 2050. It's being made as a greenwashing activities, not just by companies, but unfortunately by some nations as well, to show they're there, but in essence, we are not there, to be honest. Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay, so I think we actually can foresee that actually to achieve net zero 2050 is very ambitious and very, very challenging. But hopefully with our role, it can be happen. Hopefully. Yeah. Okay. So if you look at the currently, our fossil fuel is still highly subsidized. Yeah. It's still highly subsidized. And so what is your comment in terms of hydrogen penetration? Do you think that this is something that we have to shift from highly subsidized into non-subsidized? So what is your comment about this, Encik Irwan?
Okay. So that's why definitely it will be having an impact. So with high subsidy, then all these new technologies, low carbon technologies, will be a bit difficult if you look at from the financial perspective, the visibility, the returns, and so on. Right? That's from that perspective. Even from our perspective, from our energy perspective, we are a non-subsidized tariff in Malaysia. So most of our again hydro, and then supplement by coal and gas. So all are native. We are not exposed to international pricing for coal. But again, that's why to introduce new technology, because the tariff from hydro is very cheap. It's affordable. It's not cheap, like affordable. So that to push low technology kind of adoptions might be a bit challenging. Why we should go for solar? Because hydro is still cheaper. If you look at tariff LCOE of that energy, again similar for Peninsula. I think the subsidized might reduce the adaptation of low carbon technology, but for us, because of hydro, it's already affordable enough for now. But maybe in the future, in terms of other drivers that to push the technologies, for example, having REC, having carbon credits as one of the revenue to push this project into a more feasible into financing part of it. I think that's in short my response to that.
Thank you so much. And then I think everyone knows that Bursa has launched a national voluntary carbon market in, I think, end of last year. So provide and Dr. Chen can give some comments in terms of this initiative and how actually this initiative can support the target to for the emission reductions. Yeah.
So voluntary carbon markets are always very finicky. They're only very functional in a context of a society that values the carbon credit. And what I mean by that is that it's hard for willing buyers and willing sellers to price something in an environment that doesn't really require the item. So it's a good initiative. I'm not saying that this is something that should not be done. But I feel that I use the term social infrastructure for carbon credits, has not yet matured to the point where it can survive on its own. So where I'm going with that is the idea that as an academic, we can always say, what's the ideal situation? The ideal situation would have been a system where the government or the Bursa system itself already has regulatory requirements for either a certain level of carbon cap and trade. So you cap every producer to a certain amount of carbons, and then they have to trade amongst themselves in order to reward those who are under their cap. So they improve their carbon efficiency, selling those credits to those who have not achieved their targets to create the market. Or you create a carbon taxation system where you just say everybody has a certain amount of price that they have to pay per unit carbon that you create. Or you can buy carbon credits from somewhere so you don't have to pay the tax. So that ecosystem to drive the sale or the value of voluntary carbon credits, I feel, is still a bit lacking. Which is why we have this situation here where what is the value of carbon credits now in the voluntary market? At the moment, I would say the primary value is mainly on the marketing side, because it's not a requirement. Right? You buy the carbon credits because it helps you to achieve the marketing of net zero. So it's a marketing tool in that sense. And so that's where I think at the moment that's the primary weakness of the voluntary carbon market. The exercise of making the infrastructure for selling and buying, that's great. But to create the activity on the market requires something else. And I'm not sure exactly what that something else is. I've given two examples where you could push the market to do so. But at the moment, there needs to be an outside driver to push the value so that people do want to buy and sell. Because without buyers, you don't have a market. You cannot incentivize sellers to produce the carbon credits.
All right. So, okay. All right. So maybe, okay, this is going to be our last round. So maybe Dr. Wira can tell what is your wish and what would be the best plan for us to achieve net zero and also to support SDG for our nation.
I think the thing that we need to have is to actually make a proper pledge on achieving a certain level of net zero, and again have a specific action plan that had already been actually done by the government. The policies for the government is pointing out towards wanting to achieve what we had actually pledged. But I think population-wise, there lies a situation whereby there's a misunderstanding among the citizens that we are okay and we can still consume our electricity as usual because we had actually been blessed with the huge amount of subsidies for our electricity, I mean to the tune of even at least 60%. And it is slowly changing now. We already admit whatever 100 ringgit we pay for our electricity, actually, there should be another 60 ringgit to be put on top of that amount. To the point that the consumer could change their behavior as well. But that is, of course, not enough if we want to make a change globally. Because we are not actually a huge, in comparison to other nations, to that G7 of 50% of the greenhouse gas emitters. We are not that kind of huge emitters, but we can actually show to other nations how a small Malaysia could actually be a good example in achieving net zero. So we can make our nation proud by showing we can be there without actually playing around with greenwashing pledge, without playing around with the system under UNFCCC on those kind of false declarations. Okay, that's my wish.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Dr. Wira. And how about Dr. Chen? So how we want to make this happen? Any suggestions or plan that we should do?
I would always say we will need to tackle the energy sector first. And I'm referring to this idea of right now, we produce a lot of our energy on the peninsula side, not in Sarawak, but on the peninsula side using fossil fuels as a primary fuel. Before we go to trying to think about subsidy reduction of fossil fuel subsidies for consumers, or the electrification of cars or buses or motorbikes, I think that we will really need to at least be able to answer two questions. First is, how fast can we move away from fossil fuel energy generation on the peninsula side? Because if you don't do that, the creation of an electrified transportation system will only mean that we are shifting from petroleum to coal, effectively. The second question is our energy infrastructure ready to take the load? Because what effectively we are saying, if we say we want to electrify transportation, for example, is that we are going to replace our petrol stations, our petrol tankers, the whole infrastructure of our society that we've built, the mechanics, the bengkel, all of this will have to transition to a whole new way of life. So that planning, I feel, needs to be done, and needs to be done quite quickly, because that's holding up everything else. So we can have all these nice plans at the, shall I say, consumer end. We talk about, should we increase tariffs? Should we remove subsidies? Should we, transition from internal combustion buses to electric buses? All that is great. But if the back end, the grid itself, is still dirty, if our grids will blow, if, in terms of you don't have enough electricity capacity, energy capacity to actually power all of these charging vehicles, then you can end up trying to achieve something on the consumer end and not be able to implement it because infrastructure is not ready. So for me, that would be the first step in the... It is a long list of things, but I think that is something that is centralized, and that is something that is easier, in my opinion, because there are fewer players. If you want to talk about how to remove petroleum subsidies, I think that it affects too many at the same time. Too many things. But if you talk about the power producers, there are only a few players, and the government is involved. So that would be something that should be the first priority.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. And now we come to our last panels. So how do you think that industry can play a significant role to make this happen? Because we also have industry here. So probably you can share from your experience, how the industry can play the role.
I think giving a perspective from energy sector first, if you talk about net zero or 1.5 degree C or sustainability of it, I think everyone knows about the three dilemma, triangle, right, that we need to achieve. Okay, it should be security, sustainability, and affordability. So that's the key questions. For us, we have, not to say we are bragging about it, but we tick all these requirements. Then how we can move forwards to that? Okay, that's the way we look at it. And we should be saying all these requirements. It's not just about climate change. It's not just about environment kind of thing. It should be, whatever we do, should be linked to our improvement, productivity, okay, of our operations. So once we improve our productivity, that also improve toward our climate, toward our 1.5 degree C targets or carbon reduction. That's one. Secondly, it's all about future-proof of our business. Okay, so that's what we believe in, to future-proof our business, so that we have seen all this requirement coming in, the sebum coming in. So it's impact our bulk customer, OM mineral, precious metal, they are exporting to Europe. So the carbon border adjustment really impacting them. So they start asking us, hey, have you reports or have you keep tracks of your emission? Yes, we have. Do you have this data been validated by third party? Yes, we have. So meeting that requirement in the future. So that again is about competitive advantage, so that we can attract more investors. Moving forward, everyone have a role, solar energy, because we are quite unique because we have that potential as well. Okay, so then how we can increase the impact, the positive impact, bigger. All right. For here, I think coming from Tenaga, the main challenge will be the grid, how to decarbonize and so on. But definitely answer, if we think hard enough, there's certain push, everyone play their role, and I always believe in creating alliance. Okay, all the industries creating alliance with academician to prove that, hey, Mr. Government, we need to do something like this. So hopefully that will keep, what I call, creating tractions on what we do, putting ourselves toward the right track. And the key one will be measuring it, progress. Maybe the target is not that. Yeah, we're also thinking about that before when we are setting our science-based targets, either intensity or absolute. So we are having that thinking. So when Dr. Chen mentioned it, okay, we go through that phase. But again, everyone, especially academician, honestly, because our department, sorry, bit longer. I think this is my wish list, because our department is growing. So most of the workforce that come into the system, somehow, yes, they are technically sound, but there's something that we need to improve. For example, the strategic thinking of it. They can be a civil engineer, they can be a chemical engineer, or they can be in finance. But I think the strategic part bit missing, because during the interviews, how I wish you, because that's a mindset. So that having the right mindset, if something can be done, that would be great. Thank you.
All right. So thank you, Cik Irwan. So now I think let's move to Q&A session. So ladies and gentlemen, if you have any question, please feel free to ask to our panelists here. So any question from the floor?
Thank you so much. Thank you to very insightful information, details from the distinguished panelists. So just to actually, I'm Dr. Sun from IUKL. Just to cap back on whatever was discussed, just to try and pose a realistic question to the panelists. How realistic is this for Malaysia to move away on its dependence on fossil fuel? I'm talking about oil and gas, and how does this how will it impact actually our net zero goal 2050?
Okay, so any panelists want to answer?
I can go and give an example. So let's talk about the most ideal scenario. So one of the scenarios that we have proposed in the Jeffrey Sachs Center is that if you look from a purely scientific perspective, the most ideal, efficient way to deal with the problem would be to utilize solar power from Australia. And the idea here is that in a perfect world, you would have a ASEAN unified electrical grid to use excess capability of solar panels or solar energy in northern Australia, as well as wind power in Vietnam. These are the two areas, if you really want to have a complete optimized energy system, those would be the best case scenario. Having said that, we talk about energy security, right? Malaysia has had, in our history, in recent history at least, we have had the comfort of being an energy provider. The mental shift to becoming an energy importer, will be quite significant. That would be a quite jarring change, I think, from a social perspective as well as an economic perspective. So now, can this be done? Singapore, from their perspective, they are an energy consumer in all scenarios. They will have to either import hydrocarbon or import solar from Australia or import energy from somewhere. So for them, this is okay. For us, as the question is, it will be, shall we say, politically difficult to go in that direction. So now what's the second best option? The second best option would be to say that we at least try to leverage on the fact that we have consistent solar power, not on a daily basis, but on a yearly basis. So what I mean by that is that we don't have a scenario in Malaysia where solar power is super consistent because we have cloud cover. We are a rainforest, we do have rain, and that interferes with our energy, what we call it, we have high intermittency compared to a desert. But the good news for us is we don't have seasons, so we don't have to deal with winter. Now, under those scenarios, how much can we change? How much can we rely on solar power? The answer to that question is something that, so for example, Sunway Group has got my team to test what's the area of solar panels and batteries we would need to turn Sunway City completely net zero in terms of energy consumption. And the reason we are doing that is because we already have solar panels on our buildings, very small relative to the use. But the exercise is this: we have data over the last few years that actually shows us the day-to-day adjustments on a 5-minute interval. How much power are we getting from these panels over the course of the last 5 years? And we want to project forward, okay, we are only producing 5% of our power from solar. What will it take for us to go 100%? Why am I telling this part? Well, I believe that is one way that individual Malaysian corporations, or individuals for that matter, can try to see whether for yourself you can become personally net zero, at least on electricity. It will not be the best. We don't have the most ideal solar power environment, but that is one way forward, the next best option, I would say. So can we move to that, moving away from fossil fuels? We have a chance. We are not a nation that does not have the resources. We are not a nation that does not have the stability. That's one thing that gets lost sometimes is we actually have a very stable nation. And that enables us to do at least the long-term planning that will be required. Because if you don't have that, you would not have the timeline to put in the investment, to put up the infrastructure. So I believe that we have, we are not definitively unable to do it, but it will be difficult. So to recap, sorry about this, the summary is there is a way for us to, at the ASEAN level, become very efficient, to move away from fossil fuel. But at the national level, there is a chance, but it will be very piecemeal. I don't think we'll be able to move completely away at the national level. Thoughts on that? Yeah.
You want to
Yeah,
give any input?
I think, again, you're asking about the oil and gas part, right? I'm not the right person to answer that. But I think from a sustainability perspective, from the climate perspective, that's why data is important, inventory is important. That's why my response to that, if the company go through SBTI, science-based targets, they need to measure their scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Right? For us, we have to measure all. But again, if you look at Petronas, the one that I know, they just, for SBTI, the calculation they're looking at scope 1, their commitment scope 1, scope 2. How about scope 3? Product sold, the end use of product sold. So it's different. I see we have different emissions. So for us, it's about 20%. Right? For Petronas might be higher. Again, it's a very difficult question. How is kind of supply demand and so on? When we should be using or we move away from fossil fuel? There's no single answer to this. Just that, again, once we have a solid data in front of us, a solid inventories, how from policy side, how are we going to manage it? From corporate side, whether it makes sense or not for us to opt for option 1, option 2, option 3. So all this need to be answered. It's a difficult question. We just need to put it on the table and try to resolve it. I think that's why Petronas going for Gantari, one of their renewable energy arm. That's my speculation. maybe I get it. That's why they're very, very, what we call, active in renewable energy, right? They're talking to us, they're talking with other developers as well. So that's my response. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree, totally agree that actually data and inventory is very, very important for us to establish the baseline, and then from there we know how we want to move forward. Yeah. Yep. Maybe one more question, one last question from the floor. Anyone to say or to ask something? Yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you. My question is about the behavior among the masses. We are talking about the technology and all that we can do, but I'm talking about the layman in terms of awareness among the public on climate change, all this. I think it has to go back to the basics. So how do you think that the current awareness in our country? I think most people are not willing to change their behavior, to change their lifestyle. So I think this is one of the major aspects that we have to look into in order to have a complete approach to tackle climate change and also zero emission. Your thoughts on that? Much have we done, and is it sufficient for us to have I mean, from the country itself, do we have a political will to approach this problem?
Okay.
Dr. Wira want to answer the questions?
Right, I'll try to answer the question. I think the masses, sometimes you need to actually apply a carrot and stick approach. People would take a don't care attitude if they're not going to be hit in the pockets, for example. You can actually take that approach by having actually a proper legislation, a proper regulatory framework that could actually make a change to how people would behave. Having the kind of subsidies, I think in the last few months or even the last few years, the government had been saying providing subsidies to electricity is not sustainable. Those money should actually be put into other areas to allow people to actually enjoy a more comfortable life. But people had actually been blessed with a low electricity tariff for decades. People already happy with that, and it's difficult to win off this cheap electricity to them. And you could actually see manufacturing companies, they come to Malaysia because of the cheap electricity tariff. And it is actually moving down to the bottom of the society as well. We're already happy with this kind of situation. That needs to change. But of course, the energy trilemma, which had actually been said just now, it's another factor that we need to follow, another factor that we need to consider so that we are not going to get compromised economically and socially if you want to actually allow people to change. The situation now is different for those in primary school and secondary schools. They had already been taught about environmental protection. They had already been taught about sustainability in sustainability subjects, in technology subjects, in science-based subjects. That is quite okay, but I'm talking about the so-called lost generations, those who are perhaps 30 plus above. This is where we need to actually have better strategy to approach these age groups so that we could actually be having less problems in the future. That's my point.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Wira. I think I already got a reminder from the organizer to wrap up this session. So now we comes to the end of the session, and I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to all the panelists for insightful informations and sharing, and also play a vital role in making the Minda Profesor session today a resounding success. So, and also to all the ladies and gentlemen, so thank you so much for your attention until the end. And also, we hope that we can have this kind of session again in the future. And I think with that, thank you so much. And I wish a success for your career, and also we can play our role to help our nation to achieve net zero, and also to support the SDG. Right. Thank you so much.